The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. When Flannery O'Connor died, she left behind an unfinished manuscript for a novel called Why Do the Heathen Rage? That manuscript remained largely undisturbed until a few years ago, when O'Connor's estate entrusted it to Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson to edit and prepare for publication. Jessica is my guest on this episode of The Habit. She's an associate professor of humanities at John Brown University in Arkansas, and the author of books on Fyodor Dostoevsky, Walker Percy, and the Devil. I should mention that Dr. Wilson is pretty limited as to what she can say specifically about the O'Connor manuscript that she's working on, but she's ready to talk all day about Flannery O'Connor's creative process and what she has learned by working with the manuscript. Jessica Hooten Wilson, I'm so glad that you made time to talk to me today on the Habit Podcast. I am so excited. You probably know how much I love Flannery O'Connor, and I'm just really thrilled to get to talk to you about her and about her writing process and whatever else comes out of it.
Yeah, it's my favorite subject.
Good. Wait, really? Not Dostoevsky?
Yeah.
Not? Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, there's competition, but primarily it's O'Connor always.
Okay. Well, you are editing, preparing for publication this manuscript that O'Connor left unfinished. Tell me some things you learned about her process as you've gone through that process.
Yes. Well, I started working in her archives back in 2010 when Billy in Milledgeville, that's right, at the Georgia College State University.
Yeah.
O'Connor went to school there when it used to be Georgia Women's College. And she left all her papers to the school, to her alma mater. So, and her friend, Billy Sessions, who put out her prayer journal several years ago, he and I met up back in 2009. We were in Rome together at one of the international Flannery O'Connor conferences. And I was studying Dostoevsky's connections with O'Connor, and he said, you really need to take a look at her unfinished papers, which of course I had never heard of before, because he said they were the most Dostoevskian of all of her work. And I thought, oh my goodness, what? And so I went and they had been put onto like a old microfilm, but you couldn't it's not like you could check them out or anything. You had to sit there. And so it took several trips back and forth to Milledgeville to kind of get a sense of her manuscripts and what she was doing. And there was, of course, no order to the papers that she had left behind. Some of them were just written by hand, some of the notes, some of her ideas. So I really got the sense of, okay, this is what it looks like in process for one of her novels, right? And she left behind also the manuscripts for Violent Buried Away, and so you get to see that in process as well. So
I ran across I only had a couple of hours in that archive, and I just more or less randomly picked up an early manuscript of The Life You Save May Be Your Own. And and it was so different. There was this whole business about Mr. Shiflett when he was a little boy getting mixed up with a phrenologist, and it was crazy. And none of it's all gone. I mean, none of that survives into the published version. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, well, I think that's actually what she does. Is she does almost character sketches, and a lot of what she left behind in Why the Heathen Rage may never have ended up in the novel. She was, in a sense, just trying to get to know the characters. So she investigates their past. She tries to think of them as kids. And now, in preparing the materials for publication, she's not here to kind of edit those pieces out. And I think people would want to still see that, even though she may not have intended it to be in the actual novel, so that we still get a sense of like what it is that she looks at when she thought of these characters, who they were when they were young, and really get a sense of why she just writes paragraph after paragraph from all their different points of view, even just trying to figure out who is the protagonist and who's in charge of this narrative before zooming in on one perspective.
Yeah. In her early letters, the letters that she wrote early in the process for Wise Blood, she talked as if Enoch were the main character.
Right. Yes. And so she was always like doing stories from different characters' points of view. I mean, if you see The Violent Buried Away, she wrote these thesis stories where Raber was the main character. And so she was really hooked on the school teacher as a future main character. But of course, in The Violent Buried Away, he doesn't become the protagonist. It's Tarwater. So, she was always playing with that just to try to figure out whose story she was telling.
That's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, well, and I can talk about Why Did the Heathen Rage? At least the published version, you get a sense of the several characters that she had in mind, the different ones that she was trying to understand. And so you have Walter and Mrs. Tillman and Mr. Tillman and Mary Maud, and these are kind of resurrections of some characters she's written before.
You're talking about the one that's published as a short story. Right.
She published 7 pages out of the 378 pages she left behind. So, and she did that. She published that actually the year she died.
Okay. I was going to ask you how late that was published.
Yes, very late. And she even wrote, no new novel is forthcoming, because for her, novels took, the first novel took 5 years, the next took 7. And she was only 18 months into this process before she passed away.
Yeah.
Wow. So it had hardly begun. Yeah.
Yeah. I know she really, wrote about struggling with writer's block as she was working on Violent Buried Away. Was she plugging right along on this one?
No.
Why Did the Heathen Rage?
No, not at all. I mean, she said at one point that I feel like a squirrel on a treadmill going nowhere, and which is a great description. It's very Flannery-esque.
Yeah.
But she really got stuck with Walter, and she always talked to her characters like they were people, and so she kept saying things like, "Poor Walter, he and I just aren't getting along," and she didn't know what to do with him, and it was like hanging out with friends for her. Who are these people? And just trying to get to know them was part of the writing process for her. And so when she said when she was writing Violent Buried Away that my novel's at an impasse, right? And so when she went to Lourdes to go to the healing waters over there in France, and she prayed for her novel instead of praying for her bones.
Yeah, right.
And it was the same at the end here. So it's 1962, and she's trying to write this Why Did the Heathen Rage, and it's just continually blocking her, and she can't get anywhere with it. And instead of praying in her last days, for am I going to make it through this process? She was constantly praying for this book, for this story.
Yeah. Which actually says a lot about her sense of calling in her work. That's really what she was. She wasn't being self-indulgent in that. She really felt like, it seems to me, that she was praying for that the way anybody prays for their calling, for the strength to fulfill their calling. And
yeah.
And it's
well,
really,
if you read her.
Go ahead, Jessica.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you read her letters, I'm sure you've read her letters, where she's writing about her calling and her prayers for her calling, and she would constantly ask God for the story, right?
Yeah.
So she would say, Lord, give me your story, Lord, give me your story. And then she'd write sometimes when she got one, and she'd say, Lord, thank you for your story. I know it came from you. It couldn't have come from anywhere else. And so she was aware of where the stories came from and what their purpose was.
Yeah. And it's also really remarkable to think about the ways she stewarded her strength. What physical strength she had in the last few years, she was really reserving for, for the physical demands of typing out a manuscript.
Right.
I say the physical. There's energy and something like physical energy required just to come up with the story itself, but then typing away. Do you know?
Right.
Did she always? She got an electric typewriter toward the end of her life, correct?
That's right. In 1961, she was using it just for correspondence, and then she started typing fiction on it about a year or so later because, again, she was losing strength, and so it helped quite a bit in that process. But she said it types faster than I can think, so she was not too much of a fan. In some ways, we have to wonder how it was actually changing her writing, since it was writing so much more quickly than she could, right? So how would that change what words immediately come to mind and whether you can think of new ones? It's not like she had a thesaurus at her beck and call,
right.
So what kind of vocabulary would come out if you were just writing so quickly, whereas you were used to writing things by hand?
Yeah. Yeah, so many people now talk about tapping away on the computer. I write longhand, and people say, "Oh gosh, that's so slow. I couldn't keep up. My ideas go too fast to write longhand." It's interesting to think about Flannery O'Connor saying, "Oh no, this electric typewriter is going too fast for my ideas."
Right. Yeah, exactly. She had to slow down. She wanted to think about each word the way a poet would, right? So she's not ever going to just throw the ideas on the page or throw the story out, because for her, being a writer meant paying attention to the words and the order they're going in and the syntax. So, most of her rewriting was at that level. She was constantly attending to the small pieces of writing that made a story and not just the overall structure of the story, right?
Yeah.
Which was also a concern, that you can type on an electric typewriter and still get the same idea or big plot out, but not if you're trying to really focus on the words themselves.
Yeah. Let me ask you, how do you know about when she stopped using the manual typewriter, when she started using the electric?
Her letters. So in her letters, she tells her correspondents, "Can you tell that I'm writing on an electric typewriter? Forgive all the spelling mishaps," and things like that. And then she says stuff along the lines of, "I'm not using it to write fiction yet because it types faster than I can think." And then later she said, "To reserve my strength, I've got to start writing on this thing."
Okay.
So she
I just
tells
remember,
us.
When I was writing my biography of her, I remember being confused about. I knew she owned an electric typewriter, but somehow, and now it's been a while since I've read it, so I didn't know. I knew she had an electric typewriter she wasn't using. I didn't realize that she was using.
Yeah,
at least I've forgotten that she was using it for correspondence, but not for fiction. That's really interesting.
Yeah. She used it for quite a long time with her correspondence before she would jump over to the fiction. So.
Okay. I think you and I talked about this the other day. The other issue she had with technology was she got a television.
Yeah, 1961. She got one from the Nuns that she had written.
The Memoir for Mary Ann. She wrote that. Yeah, that is so funny.
Yeah.
And she liked watching car racing on it, didn't she?
Yeah, well, she enjoyed watching the politics that were going on, right? Because that was a recent thing. You always heard it on the radio, but you didn't get to see it. And she thought it was a skit worthy of her own writing, that you have these kind of politicians acting silly up on stage. So she thought that was quite humorous. And then she would watch comedies. She would watch comedy skits and get a kick out of it. So, yeah. She said she was a little bit addicted. It would keep her from her writing sometimes.
Yeah,
you can imagine.
Yeah.
Nowadays.
Good thing she didn't have Netflix.
Oh, yeah, I know. Streaming, we would have lost Flannery O'Connor.
No, but it is pretty remarkable to think about, isn't it? Somebody who, somebody who was Flannery O'Connor, letting TV get in the way.
Well, Walker Percy was the same way. I mean,
really?
I don't want to go on a tangent, but Walker Percy was the same way. He was addicted to watching the Hulk and soap operas, and he had to stop in the middle of the day from his writing to watch them because he just couldn't get away from them.
Oh, that is so funny. I had no idea.
Yeah.
For
he's
some
really
reason,
into the Hulk, which I think is weird.
For some reason, that seems more surprising for Walker Percy than for Flannery O'Connor to me.
Really?
Like, I
wonder why.
Yeah, I wasn't shocked when I heard that she would watch W.C. Fields on TV.
Yeah.
That didn't seem too shocking to me. But I don't know. Walker Percy just seems. I just think of him as I don't know.
Well, did you ever read Confederacy of Dunces?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know how he would watch the dramas of reality TV, and then he would just yell at the screen that this is an abomination. That to me is what I envision when I think of Walker Percy watching soap operas. Is just holding a bourbon in one hand, going, "That's an abomination."
That may be right. Okay, so Flannery O'Connor. Let's talk about her daily schedule.
Yes, she was very rigorous about her schedule and told everyone in the household that she was not to be disturbed between the hours of pretty much 9 to noon is what she kept. She got up in the morning with her mother, and they listened to the radio and drank coffee, and then they would go to mass and come back, and her mother would go do work on the farm, and Flannery would write, facing away from the window. So no distractions. Not even looking at the pond across the street, but facing inward towards her wardrobe so that she couldn't see anything except for her characters.
For 3 hours, then lunch at the Sanford house.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, you're the biographer. You know all these things probably better than I do. Yeah, she would go have lunch and then, of course, come home and usually entertain guests or correspond in the afternoon. So she wasn't without a social life, but she would always talk about she could only write 3 hours in the morning, and then she had to spend the rest of the day recovering, right?
Yeah.
Imagine if the rest of us kept that schedule. I wonder how much more productive we would be, more fruitful maybe. Maybe all of us are product-oriented, but not as fruitful as she is.
Yeah. It's the rigor with which she kept that was pretty remarkable. And the other remarkable thing, one of many remarkable things, was this mother who didn't exactly get what she was up to, and yet was so protective of Flannery's time. And I think Regina is such a remarkable part of that story. And just that loving relationship, which is not based on understanding exactly. It's just based on love.
Right.
And
I think love of the Lord first and foremost for Regina. So of course she loved her daughter, but she believed in her daughter's calling because the way she loved the Lord. They both loved the Lord so much that was just kind of at the center of everything. I think that if they didn't have that, I'm not sure Regina would understand her calling as much, right? Yeah. And it's the irrational divine sense of calling that people can't always get a hold of. And I don't think Regina understood it rationally, but she believed enough to believe in her daughter's sense of calling, which I just find wonderful.
I love it in Flannery O'Connor's letters when she describes her mother, reading her books. She'd come in half an hour later and she'd be asleep on page 9. And.
Yeah. Yeah, because Marianne, her friend, O'Connor's friend, was even like, does your mother recognize herself in these characters? And Flannery's like, she don't read any of it. Yeah. So, and that's the only way you can get away with stuff. I mean, how many of us as writers have thought, I could just turn this person into a character, but I don't want them to recognize themselves.
Yeah. And there's also that moment when she was just worried sick that her aunt was going to be offended by her, I guess, by wise blood. and then what did she say? She said, her aunt just said, I do not like this book. And then, 10 years later, she's going strong,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I like to tell my students all the time, when they're worried about what people think about their work, it's just really going to impinge upon what they're able to produce, right? They can't worry about that. And even O'Connor said, praise or censure is going to be bad for any writer. You just can't have too much of either.
Yeah. Yeah.
You just got to keep writing.
Yeah. Have you ever written fiction?
I have, yes.
Okay.
I always say that if my talent for writing fiction was only used to pay for my college, then that was great. But when I was a teenager, I was said I'm bound to be a novelist, so I went to Pepperdine University to get a creative writing degree.
Pepperdine, you said?
Yeah, and I won a full ride scholarship in creative writing for 4 years. So,
okay.
Yeah, so for me, it was just, at least I'm able to write stories enough to be able to pay for college, then I'm good.
Yeah.
But I still teach it. I still write now. I write a lot of nonfiction, short fiction, poetry. So, but of course, I also do academic writing. So it's just I'm a hodgepodge. I'm a writer as a verb. I don't know if I have one specific genre.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just talking to Karen Swallow Pryor earlier today for an earlier episode. And
I love her.
I know. And we were on the subject of making the switch from academic writing to popular writing.
Yeah.
What thoughts do you have on switching from academic writing to fiction?
Oh man, a lot, but it is really tough to go back and forth. I at least have luminary heroes who did it. So you imagine people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and you're like, okay, they did it. It can be done, right? So It is possible to do. Walker Percy would be another example, somebody who could do it. But I think you have to have certain spaces, at least for me, that's what I do. It sounds superstitious, but I only creatively write in certain spaces, and I only academically write in certain spaces.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, maybe that sounds superstitious, but I don't think it actually is. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, really. I mean, we need it's basically a matter of liturgy, right? Of habits and bodily habits, because you're not just a brain on a stick. You're a body.
Yeah, and so that's how I foster it. That I can get in a much more academic mind if I'm in my office, if I'm in a library. If I'm just surrounded by books that way, that I can kind of draw from and pull from other people's materials and make things make sense to people. And but if I'm doing creative and I'm kind of staring at that blank page, then for me, I need to be in like a coffee shop, or I need to be outdoors where I just have sensory overload, which sounds so strange. But if I can do sensory overload, then it keeps whatever part of my brain wants to get distracted on those things, and I focus on the writing. I just focus on creating the material.
So you need more distraction when you're writing creative writing or fiction than you do when you're writing academic writing.
Yep. There's this novelist, Jocelyn Jackson, and she explained it really well. She said, you need your monkey brain, like those of us especially who are extroverts like that, we need our monkey brain distracted so that we don't click to new sites or like go on the internet or something. And so if my monkey brain is like paying attention to other people's conversations or listening to the music at the coffee shop or just smelling coffee, then I can actually have my other brain sit down and focus.
Huh.
Whereas if I'm in a quiet room, my monkey brain is like, you better give me something to play with, or I'm going to keep you from your work this whole time.
Oh, that's funny. Sometimes I've been known to sit in a coffee shop and play coffee shop sounds on my earbuds.
Oh, really? No way.
Because in the coffee shop sounds, you can't understand. You can tell people are talking, but you can't understand their words. Whereas in a coffee shop, if somebody near me is saying something vaguely interesting, I want to know what's going on. I don't want to miss out on that.
That is true, but I do sometimes get my inspiration from it too. I'll find myself typing away and I get distracted by that conversation, but then I just write it down and keep going.
That's a good idea.
Put it in its own little sticky note and type the whole conversation out.
Yeah. It's like Flannery O'Connor and all her visits to the doctor becoming, fodder for Revelation.
Yeah.
She said that story was her gift, was her reward for all her trips to the doctor.
Yeah, you look at her letters. I mean, she records almost an exact Revelation scene, except that nobody throws a book at the person. And you could just imagine she's the one sitting there being like, if only I could throw a book at that. It was a man in her letters, but if I could just throw a book at that man,
Yeah. And another thing that's striking is how many of those, if you look at her letters and those items that make their way into her stories, those little details, or whether they make them into the letters or not, into the stories or not, so many of those most delicious details in her letters are things she got from her mother. Things that her mother saw on her rounds and then would come home and report. So that there's another reason to appreciate Regina.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Regina really does appear in her fiction all over the place, and not just as an imposing figure, though she definitely writes about her foibles. But I think one of the great things about O'Connor is she's such a generous writer that she writes about people's imperfections as well as their good qualities. I mean, you never just have villains and saints in O'Connor's world, and that's you can see that in her real life. She just didn't seem to see people that way. She makes fun of friends in her letters, but then she also sees their good attributes, and when they appear in her stories, sometimes they're the best person in the story,
Yeah. I mean, Mariette Lee, I can't decide. It's so hard to know how she felt about her.
I
it's
know.
not. I mean, it's not that hard. She felt she really loved her, but she just couldn't tell how she...
Well, because she provided so much care, right? I mean, Mariette Lee, for people who don't know, was one of her good friends in New York, but they were so different from one another because Mariette had left the South and, put all that behind her. And she was, a civil rights activist, and she was going to extremes to, expose injustice. And so a large sense, Mariette Lee was a foible, right? Or a foil against O'Connor. And they kind of played those roles with one another. And so O'Connor was able to turn her into a more extreme version of herself in the characters that she writes, as Gray Fox and Julian and
Yeah. I'd never thought of this formulation before, but I think it might be really helpful to think about O'Connor's view of the world. There were lots of people that she didn't know what she thought about them, but she knew how she felt about them.
Oh, interesting.
And Mariette Lee I'm sure she didn't know what to think about Mariette Lee, but she knew what she felt about her. And now that I think about it, there are a lot of people in my life that I don't know what to think about them, but love them anyway.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you don't know, at least for O'Connor, too, one of the things that she says in her essays all the time was she doesn't know what she thinks about anything until she writes it. Yeah. And so, writing was exploration and she's not preaching. She's not giving a message. The writing process is always helping her figure out what she thinks about these things. And I think that's important.
Yeah. Shifting out of Flannery O'Connor world, you're a pretty productive writer, and yet you are a professor. You are raising kids, and yet every time I turn around, there's some article that you've and some best I can a very well considered article. I mean, something you've done good work on, and I think what? I mean, how is this happening? So there's the question: how is this happening? All this writing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I definitely spend a lot of time doing it. I dedicate a lot of my time to doing it. And I think it is, your podcast is appropriately named The Habit, right? So the same way that Flannery O'Connor wrote every single day, I do not go days without reading or writing. In the same way that people probably, really respect their workout. I might not be able to run a marathon the way other people can, but I can keep writing. So, I respect the habits that kind of continually lead to us being better and better writers. And so I'm always, I read before bed religiously. It doesn't matter how tired I am, I'm reading at least a poem. I'm reading something all the time. And
You're not
that
reading
helps with
Thomas
my writing.
Aquinas before bed?
I'm not reading Thomas Aquinas. I do read a lot of poetry, actually. And if I had to recommend anything for becoming a better writer to people, it would be to read poetry because it gives you more words than you have at your disposal. Reading fiction, a lot of times, there's only so many ways you can tell someone, you can say somebody walked. But when you read poetry, then it's like, oh, there are more ways to say that than I even assumed or, got used to reading in the novels. And so poetry kind of opens the floodgates a little bit. So I would say reading is a big deal to keep me writing. I don't spend time online. I recently added a Twitter account only because something that I published a couple months ago, apparently everybody was up in arms about, and I had no idea how to see what they were talking about. I started receiving all these emails. And people were emailing me why aren't you on Twitter reading this stuff? And I'm because that doesn't sound fun to me. But, so I think that's really helpful when people talk about productivity.
Yeah.
My life is just really it's not in the online world. I just don't live in the Gnostic universe. I try to live in the one that I can see and touch and smell as much as possible. And so when I write, I sit down and write, and I don't do a lot of online stuff. I don't do a lot of social media stuff. And that you'd be amazed how much time that saves.
Yeah, right.
Not doing those things. And then I don't really mess around when I get to it. I'm a mom of 3 children. I work full time. I'm running a school. I founded a school in our area, which takes a lot of my time. So, I remember the scripture. I don't know how many of your readers are Christians, but for me, the scriptures talk about to whom has been given, much, much more will be required. Yeah. And that's what I think of all the time. It's just, yes, I seem to have a lot of things going on and a lot of balls in the air. But if I keep juggling well, I'm not going to actually get rid of any of them, and there's not going to be less of them. There's probably just going to be more. And that's a gifting. The Lord's going to give me whatever it is that He needs to get done, and anything that I don't need to do, He's going to just take away, and I'm just going to keep doing it. So for me, it's part of a process of a way of living and certain habits that keep me going.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that little summary. That was. I need to go home and repent or something.
Well, sorry if that was too long of an answer. But
No, not at all. And the question I always end with, actually, no, I'm not going to end with this question just yet. We're going to talk about the fact that you have roots in Warner Robins, Georgia.
Oh, yeah. My parents met in high school in Warner Robins and
my hometown.
Got married in Warner Robins. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to be indulgent.
It's a small town.
Yeah. I'm not going to be self-indulgent and talk about Warner Robins on the Habit podcast, but that was remarkable when I found out that you had Warner Robins roots.
Yeah.
Not too far from Milledgeville, right?
Yeah, I know. Well, I understand the world of O'Connor. I was born there because I've lived there.
Yeah. Okay, last question. I typically end these conversations with the question, which writers make you want to write?
Yeah, well, Flannery O'Connor is a given.
Okay.
I have wanted to write like her since I was a little girl.
A little girl, what?
Yeah, I was a teenager. I was 15 the first time someone handed me an O'Connor story, and I thought, yes, I'm going to do this forever.
Okay, I was picturing 8-year-old Jessica
Oh, no. I mean, yeah, I've been wanting to write that long, but probably not like O'Connor. And I would say some contemporary novelists that I read just for fun, they always give me inspiration. Most people aren't familiar with Gina Oaksner. And she is a Pacific Northwest novelist, and she writes about usually experiences in Eastern Europe and Russia and places that are kind of cold and on the margins. But her writing is lyrical and beautiful, and she deals with issues of life and death, and it's lovely. So The Necessary Grace to Fall would be a
The
good
Necessary Grace to Fall.
Yeah.
Okay.
With Gina. People probably think that I work for her the number of times I've recommended that book. And then Leif Anger. I love Virgil Wander. So I thought that was a masterful work that reminded me so much of Walker Percy and Charles Portis. And I thought, this is so much fun. Yeah. So it's a great summer read. I've been recommending that book to everybody this summer.
Yeah, I kind of go a very cold summer read, but a great.
Yeah,
will cool you
right?
off in the heat of summer.
But yeah, it's I always try to pick like a favorite book of the year, and right now that probably is my favorite book of the year. Yeah, it would be his book. And then Michael O'Brien. If you don't know Michael O'Brien, I really enjoy Catholic novelists. I love writers who are dealing with ultimate questions and, regarding life, both in its concrete particularity, but also transcendent. And so Michael O'Brien does that. He's a 21st century novelist who writes about the world with its unseen as well as its seen realities. And it's amazing. So Father Elijah is the first one that I would recommend for that.
All right. Duly noted.
Yeah.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for being here. I have loved having somebody to talk to about Flannery O'Connor, and I love watching your career. I love whenever I see your name on an article. I'm so glad it's there. And I especially look forward to seeing what you're going to do with the heathen. Why do the heathen rage? I have a hard time with that title for some reason.
Yeah, tongue twister.
Yeah, and but I can't wait to see. And let me just say thank you for giving that story life too, or bringing it to a wider audience. I know there are a lot of hard decisions involved in that, and so thank you for taking that on.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Well, this was fun. This is the best way I could spend my time is talking about O'Connor.
Okay, great. Well, I hope we can talk again soon.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio and the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to the Arcadian Wild for allowing us to use their delightful song Finch in the Pantry as part of this podcast. Check out their album of the same name for more excellent music.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to fostering Christ-centered community and spiritual formation through music, story, and art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.